As an 18-year-old Atlanta resident, you would think I'd be pretty familiar with Atlanta history by now. Well, you'd be right. I'm pretty well versed in the narrative of Atlanta. The narrative I was told by my early public education and by those I grew up around. This narrative is best described by one of Atlanta's most famous names, the city too busy to hate. That's the thing though. I've grown up hearing a single narrative of Atlanta, not the whole story. A narrative is a story, but with the influence of perspective. No single person can tell a story. The narrative I absorbed growing up in Atlanta is one influenced by city pride, a desire to minimize any negative elements of our history and to focus on the positive. That's why this excursion had such a profound impact on me. Because for the first time, I was finally able to weave the story of Atlanta together through various narratives, perspectives that we heard throughout our exploration of the city, combined with my own experience and the experience of my relatives who've been Atlanta citizens. Our first adventure into the city almost acts as a thesis for the rest of this excursion. The Beltline, a public works project that is being lauded as a way to fix all of the city's problems. It brings high-income businesses to communities that didn't have them before. It has art on it. It provides walking paths where there were none. At least, that's what we got from our tour guide. Now, I don't know if it was the fact that the success of the Beltline is how she makes her living, or the fact that one of the council members responsible for the Beltline was sitting a couple rows in front of her, but I don't think she could see the negative impacts of the Beltline through those rose-colored bus windows. She neglected to mention how many families are losing their homes due to rent spikes because of the gentrification that the Beltline brings to lower-income areas. Looking at these two narratives was the first time during this excursion where I was forced to look past the facts that she gave us and to decide for myself whether or not the Beltline was a good project for the city. Being forced to take the word of an expert with a grain of salt was a common theme throughout our excursion. Our tour guide at the Wren's Nest, the home of Joel Chandler Harris, mentioned his positive views on African American people and how he grew up friends with slaves, and that's where he got the Uncle Remus tales. And that's one of the most interesting facets of this excursion, thinking about what it means to be a storyteller. Joel Chandler Harris was a storyteller. He didn't create the stories, but he told them to an audience who wouldn't have seen them if he had not. Just like Akbar Imhotep came and told us the stories that we may not have heard without him coming and giving them to us. These same stories that we read in Joel Chandler Harris's Uncle Remus tales and were told by Akbar Imhotep were translated to the screen in Disney's Song of the South. Therein lies the power of a storyteller. The ability to mask over and to minimize the experiences that one would not like to speak about. At the King Center, we heard stories of people who knew the Kings. These stories are not unfamiliar to me, as my grandfather was childhood friends with Martin Luther King Jr.
Grew up knowing Martin Luther King Jr., and he and I went down the last week of the year. They had to take a physical inventory of this wholesale hardware store that my dad worked for, which means you had to count everything by hand, and then they gave everybody their bonus. And the Christmas bonus was they would have a barrel of apples and you put your hand in there and you could have as many apples as you could pick up. That was your bonus.
These intimate, personal perspectives on not an event, not a movement, but a person are what's the core of history. Another stop on our excursion was the Herndon House. It was there we met a woman, Mrs. Roberta. She told us not only the pre-existing narrative about Alonzo Herndon and how he was one of the first black millionaires and how his family did a lot for Atlanta University and founded the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, but she shared her own personal experience, her own personal narrative. She spent years working for the Atlanta Life Insurance Company and knew Alonzo's son Norris personally. She shared her experience so our story could be more complete. The High Museum's photo exhibit on the Civil Rights Movement allowed us to see the different perspectives, to see the difference between a black photographer and a white photographer, and what they could capture, the difference between a participant and an observer. Each of these photos demonstrates how different each person's experience of this historical event was, and really shows how perspectives on history can be so different from one another. The Atlanta History Center and Archive was the perfect place to wrap up this excursion around Atlanta. We have heard so many narratives, so many perspectives on Atlanta history, and are now trying to weave together the story of Atlanta. And what better place to do that than at an archive, at a history center, where there are hundreds or thousands of different perspectives on Atlanta history and the history of the South in one place. Seeing conflicting perspectives on the same event, to see that the bigoted, hateful perspectives and the compassionate and progressive perspectives are equally important to preserve, so we can really appreciate how far we've come and see how far we've yet to go.